I'm Hugh Wilson, and I'm here to tell you about an urgent matter that affects not only you, our country, but perhaps the very essence of human dignity. This story is about forced organ harvesting, the taking of vital human organs from living human beings to be sold for a profit on the transplant market. The patient dies and the perpetrators get rich. But this isn't a story. It's real. Take a look.
先摘的是心脏，然后再摘的是肾。当心脏的血管剪到一下，它就进行一阵抽搐，然后那个非常可怕的。
When they cut through, blood still come out. That's it to say, blood still running. That means this person's still alive.
So the question becomes, how has China become the #2 transplant country in the world?
The place where every other country in the world gets its organs, not available to them. Where are these organs coming from?
The staff in the operating rooms are all making a lot of money from doing it. They're not going to talk about it.
复完的时候，也未必知道自杀的。
It's a new form of evil, it's a new form of abuse, it's something that nobody's ever done before.
This is a crime against humanity.
我想，如果我要找一些劝说我的家人，找一些让他们站出来，也许会很多人存活在这个世界上。
The government in China is doing a terrible thing, which is comparable to what the Nazis did.
I actually got a death threat at one event. You're putting your own life at risk. Are you not afraid? Facing off against such a huge entity is indeed a daunting challenge. Oh, I'm one guy, David Kilgour were two guys.
It's not two Davids, it's every single thinking human being on the continent. And we're going to continue to do it, like many, many other people, until it stops.
The trailer you just saw is for an award-winning documentary about forced organ harvesting in China. It's called Human Harvest. It features the story of two prominent Canadians who did the research which opened our eyes into a dark chapter in human devolution. For the next 90 minutes, I'm going to take you on a journey into the world of forced organ harvesting. It's not pleasant, but there is an upside, so please don't turn away. Lives are at stake. Perhaps you remember the poem from English poet John Donne called For Whom the Bell Tolls. It has led to famous books and movies. As its theme, it speaks to us all. The poem tells of the old English custom of ringing the church bell whenever a member of the community died. When the bell rang, it was common for townspeople to ask, "For whom does the bell toll?" Donne concludes with these words, "Ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." He suggests that anyone's death diminishes humanity. Those who die in China as victims of the transplant tourism industry are not unrelated to you and me. Their deaths matter, for if we accept this travesty, then the bell tolls for each of us as well. Let's hear more from world experts who have verified that forced organ harvesting exists, that it's a billion-dollar business, and what can be done about it. But first, let's hear what average Canadians know about the subject.
Well, from what little I know about it, I think it's pretty horrible. Awful that you could force someone to ever do this. And I think that also I obviously am in a place of privilege where I don't have to worry about these types of things. So it's hard for me to imagine where where this even came from, how people are being forced into this. So I think it's scary and really, really sad.
Assume the context is after death, going to the hospital, and are we pushing that on individuals? Aside from organ donation, like aside from you signing the card? I'm assuming that's what it is, and I was not aware of that. Within the context of Canada and a developed nation, it's outright immoral to go and grab individuals that don't have consent, that don't have the means to defend that. So yeah, for Canada to say that they would not support or not further the advancement of any of those causes would be fine by me. So if they were to take a leading role in blocking that on an international stage, that would make sense to me.
Feels like a bit of a double-edged sword, because you want to, when it comes to just at its core, it's wrong. You cannot kill people who have rights to take their organs to give to other people. I think that theoretically there is an argument that, I'm trying to think of how it makes me feel. It's difficult. It's a difficult thing to try and conceptualize. And like I said, as I'm thinking about myself, it's illegal. It's just the way it is. It's just illegal. That's the word I would use.
I guess I've heard about forced organ harvesting on a very surface level, but nothing in depth.
Would you support Canada if Canada was to take a leading role in making forced organ harvesting a crime?
Absolutely.
If you had to encapsulate your feelings regarding this whole concept of illegal organ harvesting, how do you feel? What are your thoughts?
Scared, nervous, confused. I don't know if there's a way to put it into words, because it's just so unknown, because we don't see it, and I don't know someone who's gone through it. I think because we're not exposed to it. So I think if we were exposed to it, which I don't want to be, I think it would hit you a lot different.
You may not know much more than everyone else, but let's change that. Here's a quick PhD on forced organ harvesting from a world summit of people who care deeply about what is happening.
Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed speakers and guests, welcome to our World Summit on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting. 15 years ago, when the Epoch Times broke the news that in China organs were harvested from living prisoners of conscience, the term forced organ harvesting did not even exist. This by itself already indicates that this horrific practice is beyond our imagination and thinking as human beings. It also means that in order to understand this practice, we need to open our minds to think the unthinkable. Over the past 15 years, independent investigators and researchers used their creativity and out-of-the-box thinking to collect and accumulate credible, book-filling evidence on forced organ harvesting in China. Implausible transplant numbers, inconceivably short wait times for transplantation that can be shortened to as little as 2 days if one pays an extra premium. A public organ donation program that claims to operate on an efficiency level that is unheard of in other countries. Admissions on phone calls. And last but not least, a plethora of eyewitness testimonies that leave no doubt. It comes as no surprise that the China Tribunal, chaired by Sir Jeffrey Nice, came to the conclusion that forced organ harvesting has occurred and continues to occur in China. The primary and main victims of this transplant abuse are practitioners of Falun Gong. It is estimated that several 100,000 practitioners and even more have been killed for their organs. Yet China refuses to allow independent, unscheduled inspections, calling the issue an internal affair. How can we respond at this point? history teaches us once again an important lesson. It is impossible to speak about the Holocaust without mentioning the Jewish people. And in the same sense, it is also impossible to speak about forced organ harvesting in China without mentioning the Falun Gong. Although the Chinese government attempts to deflect public attention by claiming the issue is an internal affair and thus declaring it a taboo topic, neither was the Holocaust an internal affair of the Nazi regime, nor is the forced organ harvesting of living Falun Gong practitioners an internal affair of the Chinese state. In fact, in both cases, these are international affairs. This is the case not only because of its character of being a crime against humanity, but in particular in the context of forced organ harvesting with its ties to international transplant tourism, academic exchange of transplant knowledge, training of Chinese students and trading of transplant-related drugs and technical supply. Does the international community have the duty and responsibility to address this transplant abuse? This World Summit on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting wishes to be an inspiration to galvanize further awareness and action. We will hear from politicians and parliamentarians how they are responding to the problem and taking legislative action. We look into the role of the news media and the issue of censorship. By default, the first task of the news media is to report facts and truth. However, another important aspect of the media is to connect people. Over the past 15 years, the mainstream media has failed to connect the people in the free world with the victims of forced organ harvesting in China. This separation between the readers and the victims is another often neglected aspect of censorship. Our World Summit aspires to overcome this problem of separating the international community from the victims of forced organ harvesting in China by sharing objective findings and insights.
Hello everybody, thank you for joining today. It's really an honor and a privilege to be talking to all of you about one of the most important medical ethical issues of our time, and that is forced organ harvesting. I wanted to shed light on several different points that I think are important in forced organ harvesting, and not so much an overview of the evidence and data, but the experience of what do we do with the evidence and data, and how does this get disseminated into our medical institutions. So the first issue I wanted to bring up was the silence that has surrounded forced organ harvesting, despite David Matas and David Kilgore's first report back in 2006, and subsequently in the last 15 years, Ethan Gutmann's report, the 2016 update to the Bloody Harvest and the Slaughter by David Matas, David Kilgore, and Ethan Gutmann, as well as the findings of the independent tribunal in 2019 and 2020, after looking at all the data, all come to the same regrettable conclusion, and that is that forced organ harvesting is indeed happening in Chinese medical institutions and transplant centers throughout the country, and this has gone really unrecognized by most of the medical community and indeed most of the world. So how has the silence been able to happen? I'd like to give a personal example. I'm at a moderate-sized academic institution in the mid part of the United States, and at our own institution, I and others have tried to do what we can to take action to stop forced organ harvesting. And one example of that is myself and somebody who runs the transplant line at our institution, where we do a moderate number of transplants annually, have tried in our own way to stop bringing Chinese over here to train in transplant and to go back to China, where they will likely participate in forced organ harvesting. And so what has happened? Well, this has not been formalized by our institution, and when I have reached out to leaders and at our institution, I essentially always get the same response, and that is there's no doubt that forced organ harvesting is happening, but that taking a stance against a large strong countries such as China could be dangerous both to our institution as well as the undergraduate and graduate schools that we serve with at our university. And one example of this was in late 2019 when I approached one of our leaders in the medical system and said that we must take a stance and we should all sit down and have a discussion about what we're going to do about forced organ harvesting, especially in light of the fact that the China Tribunal had just published their report in which they had interviewed well over 50 individuals and looked at all the data and reports themselves, mostly data that came out of China showing that they had no explanation for their incredible and exponential boom in transplant activity beginning in the early 2000s, aside from the explanation that they were killing innocent individuals for their organs. This kind of egregious and mass crime has never really been at the hand so largely of the medical community in history. So when I approached our leader of our medical institution, he essentially said to me that there was no doubt in his mind that the Chinese Communist Party was capable of such atrocities and that it was indeed happening, but that if we said anything, China would simply send all of its students to Texas. Well, this struck me as odd. We're not in Texas, and why would it matter if they sent their students to Texas? This kind of fear of, I think, economic retaliation has been directing, I think, a lot of the approach that we've taken. And I'm further concerned that at our own institution, in my own clinic, we've had and trained at least 2 Chinese individuals in pulmonary medicine and cardiothoracic surgery who really would find no way out of being independent when they return to China, as essentially all individuals, including all doctors and surgeons in China, are always under the thumb of the Chinese Communist Party. Further, we have individuals here who collaborate and work closely with Chinese institutions, including going over there and giving lectures and having individuals from China here, in fact, working in our laboratories and in our clinics, and such as one such individual who has Chinese working on his R01 grant in his lab. So why have we taken this approach of collaboration and engagement with China? There's a great editorial by Wendy Rogers, Matthew Robertson, and Jacob Levy that was published in the BMJ back in 2017 that I encourage you all to read. It's simply a page detailing the approach that the Transplantation Society has taken, and indeed the medical community at large, and that is one of engagement and cooperation with China after the 2006 David Matas and David Kilgore report came out. So has this stance of engagement and cooperation and collaboration worked? Well, the short answer is no. We've taken similar approaches from a diplomatic and an economic stance in the United States, really to detrimental ends. One example of this is you've seen in the last couple of years top scientists and top physicians and academicians at our institutions that have had to leave their post because of their close ties and their financial ties with the Chinese Communist Party, which they were not reporting to our federal government, which they're required to do. So if, for example, at MD Anderson in 2019 and at Moffitt Cancer Center in Southern Florida in late 2019, early 2000, 9 leaders, none of which were Chinese or Chinese American, were forced to resign or left their posts because of not reporting their close ties to the Chinese, with the Chinese government to the United States. So you can see the dangers of this close engagement and collaboration, but it's worse than that. I think collaborating and cooperating with a medical system that's under the thumb of an evil regime is dangerous. And indeed, we've seen this with forced organ harvesting. This didn't happen in a vacuum, and in fact, most of the individuals that have built the transplant centers in China, as was bragged about on medical sites before the 2006 report came out, trained in the United States and other leading Western organizations in transplant medicine.
Evidence of the mass killing of prisoners of conscience in China for their organs has been available since 2006. One reason, though far from the only, for the conclusion that these killings were occurring was that there were no laws in place, either in China or outside China, to prohibit or punish the acts. In the intervening 15 years, there has been a number of changes in the legal landscape. In this presentation, I want to give an overview of this landscape, both in China and outside of China, both internationally and nationally. In China, after the evidence was published in 2006 that China was killing prisoners of conscience, primarily practitioners of Falun Gong, for their organs, the state enacted a new law directed to organ transplant abuse, without repealing the old laws which specifically allowed that abuse. The State Council enacted a resolution on organ transplantation in March 2007. It became effective in May 2007. That law prohibits the live harvesting of organs without consent. It also prohibits the sourcing of organs from deceased who expressed when alive a wish not to donate their organs after death. As for sourcing of organs of deceased who said nothing before death, either for or against donation, the law authorized the spouse, adult children, or parents to consent. But what about sourcing of organs from deceased whose bodies were unclaimed, or about whom the near relatives were silent? On these matters, the 2000 law said nothing. There are two much older laws which address those questions. The 1979 rules of the Ministry of Health provide that dissection carried out by educational and research institutions, including medical schools, when conducting teaching or research, can be conducted on corpses which no one claims. There's no requirement of consent from anyone. A regulation of 1984, adopted by a wide range of Chinese government entities on the use of dead bodies or organs from condemned criminals, has a similar provision. It enacts that uncollected dead bodies, or the ones that the family members refuse to collect of condemned criminals, can be made use of. The 2007 law did not amend or repeal the 1979 or 1984 laws. But the legal problems in this area of China are not just a gap in the law or a failure to repeal older laws. The Chinese reality is that its Communist Party controls the legal system. The party does not use the law to prosecute itself or impede or hinder its behavior in any way. In Communist China, the law is used only against those not on good terms with the party. The rule of law does not exist in China. Instead of the rule of law, there's the rule of the party. The mass killing of prisoners of conscience for their organs in China is state-run, institutionalized. It occurs through the operation of the prison system and government hospitals, including hospitals run by the military as profit-making businesses. Typically, family members do not claim bodies of arbitrarily detained prisoners of conscience, whether Falun Gong or any other such prisoner. Families may not know where the detained relative is. They may not even know the fact of detention. Even if they know, families are often reluctant to have anything to do with the authorities for fear of being accused of not turning in the victim for having adopted a practice or behavior or belief that the Chinese Communist Party views as threatening to its supremacy. The mass killing of prisoners of conscience for their organs serves a dual purpose for the party. The killings eliminate what the party sees as its political enemies. the organ sourcing plays a large part in funding the health system. The selling of organs in China is a multi-billion-dollar business. It helps to finance the health system as a whole, allowing medical institutions and hospitals to keep their doors open after the party shifted China from socialism to capitalism and withdrew significant amounts of state funding from the health sector. It is implausible to suggest that the party would have shut down or would shut down this organ trade, no matter what the law said. At the time that David Kilgour and I did our initial report on the killing of Falun Gong for their organs, there was no international instrument prohibiting cross-border organ trafficking. The obvious candidate would have been the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons of the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. That protocol prohibits trafficking in humans for the purpose of organ removal. China is a party to both the convention and the protocol. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the UN bureaucracy charged with the work of the convention and its protocols, has regrettably taken the position that, however similar the terminology seems, trafficking in humans for the purpose of organ removal is different from organ trafficking, and that the convention and protocol do not cover organ trafficking. Into this breach came the Council of Europe, which negotiated and adopted in 2015 a convention against trafficking in human organs. The convention requires states parties to enact legislation penalizing organ removal without consent or with financial incentives. The legislation must penalize this behavior wherever in the world it is committed by a citizen or permanent resident of a state party. There are currently 11 ratifying states and 15 states which have signed but not ratified the convention. The 11 ratifying states are Albania, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Latvia, Malta, Montenegro, Norway, Portugal, Republic of Moldova, Spain, and Switzerland. These 11 states in principle should have the necessary legislation to put them in compliance with the convention. Joining the convention is not limited to member states of the Council of Europe, and indeed one non-member state, Costa Rica, has signed the convention but not ratified it. Observer states can sign on their own initiative. Non-observer states require an invitation from the Committee of the Ministers of the Council, and that, of course, that permission can, of course, be requested. In addition to Costa Rica, Canada, the US, Mexico, and the Holy See are observer states. Above and beyond the 11 Council of Europe states, we can see a few other states which have passed the necessary legislation. Israel was first off the mark. Israel in 2008 enacted a law which prohibits receipt of a reward for organ removal from the body of any person. The law also prohibits organ brokerage. The prohibitions apply whether the organ removal or transplant takes place inside or outside Israel. The law further prohibits reimbursement through the health insurance system of transplantation abroad conducted in violation of the standards of the legislation. That law was effective in almost shutting off completely transplant tourism from Israel to China. Taiwan in June 2015 enacted a law prohibiting the use of organs from executed prisoners, as well as the sale, purchase, and brokering of organs. The law specifically bans transplant tourism. Patients who get organ transplants overseas must provide legal proof of the source of the organs in order to be eligible for state-funded medical aftercare. An Italian law of December 2016 penalizes globally the trading, selling, and buying of organs. Belgium in April 2019 enacted a law which made the existing prohibition against commercial transactions in organs extraterritorial so that the crime can be prosecuted when it takes place abroad. The law penalizes brokers and organ recipients. So let me say this by way of conclusion. A number of other national jurisdictions, besides the ones I've set out, have actively considered changes in the law. There's been bills before Parliament, Congress, legislature, national assemblies, without so far enacting them. The United Nations has 193 member states. The number of states which have enacted the necessary legislation is pitifully small when compared to the size of the global community. Though there have been several changes overall since 2006, and the initial reports of the killing of Falun Gong in China for their organs, the problem remains. The changes have not been sufficient inside China to stop the mass killing of prisoners of conscience in China for their organs, and they've not been sufficient outside China to stop foreign complicity in those killings. A lot more needs to be done. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the privilege of having a conversation with you all. Unfortunately, this is not something that would really garner a lot of, I guess, excitement because it is a very difficult issue to talk about. So I'm going to come across from the perspective of the ethics and the morals. So let me begin by asking you a question. Have you ever felt invisible? Have you ever felt like you were no one, standing in front of someone else or being spoken to, as if you didn't exist? Let me give you an example. How many of us have gotten our car to a red light and stopped, and out of the corner of our eye on the left side, we notice a homeless man or homeless person? And we don't look at them. We just can't wait to get going with the green light, because we don't want to acknowledge that homeless man, thinking we need to give him something. But by virtue of the fact that we don't even look at him, we denigrate his personhood. He doesn't exist. And from my perspective, this is where I'm coming from with this whole aspect of forced organ harvesting from persons who don't exist in the minds of those who operate on them, who use them as a commodity, who use them to benefit themselves, rather than understanding that receiving an organ is a gift. So I come back to this whole concept of personhood. When we talk about personhood, that entitles everyone who's recognized as a person to rights. And the more common rights are dignity, honesty, trust, integrity. The minute that we denigrate someone by not recognizing them as a person, we can take advantage of them. We can use them. We can actually belittle them by making them just an it or a something, a commodity. In this world of forced organ harvesting, we see that this is in fact the case. The persons who are taken and put into prison and who are then used as a commodity for organs are not considered persons. They're considered, as I mentioned, a commodity. And the surgeons who operate on them, and I use that word loosely, operate, they butcher them, they're not persons themselves, because they find themselves being more into who they want to be and finding out that they are more what they are. Truly, truly not persons. We as physicians have oaths, responsibilities, we have obligations. And the primary obligation, responsibility, and duty we have is to recognize the person who's sitting across from us seeking our help as someone who we believe in as a person. A person is a person. We engage with them. We have a relationship with them. We have trust with them. There's a sense of dignity. But what we're seeing in this situation with this forced organ harvesting is that there is none of that. And from the ethical perspective, there is this significant moral just devastation of moral foundations on the part of those who take advantage of these vulnerable people. The individuals, and you notice I'm not even calling them persons, the individuals who seek out an organ by paying for it large sums of money, they themselves are not necessarily persons because they are self-gratifying themselves at the expense of someone else. So the long and short of it is, from the medical, ethical, moral perspective, there is no moral intake or input on the part of those who seek the organs other than this self-gratification, this whole concept of me first, me principle. The surgeons who do these atrocious things to the vulnerable, they themselves are so far outside the boundaries of the profession and the vocation of healing, are they themselves completely unworthy of the gift that was given to them of being a physician healer.
In the greater area of Copenhagen, where I'm running for council, we have a friendship agreement with China. And I think that's a bit hypocritical, because we are also a region that is promoting UN development goals a lot, and always trying to do what is best in this world. But I think you can't, on the one hand, always working for making this world better, doing what is right, and doing what is going to put the world in a better direction, and then, on the other hand, have a friendship agreement with China, and pillow talking with the regime about the friendship and how great it is and what you're going to do together to make this world better. Because the Chinese regime is not doing this world better, it's doing evil things to this world. Therefore, the first proposal I'm going to put off, if I'm elected to the Regional Council in the Great Area of Copenhagen, is to make sure that all friendship agreement with China will be deleted at the time. And I'm going to make sure that we are never going down that direction again. Because as a region that believes in human rights, that believe in development, that believe in equality for human beings, we can't be friends with a country where they are making a genocide against the Uyghurs, cracking down on the Hong Kongers, and stealing organs from the Falun Gong. I do though have one positive thing to say here today, even though this is a very dark subject. I think that in my generations, new political waves are coming up, and I feel them. We don't just want to sell our products to China, if that means we can't tell the truth about what China is doing, and if that means we are selling out our own soul. Therefore, on a positive note, I think this world is going to move in a better direction, in a direction where especially European countries who have been falling behind will step up and say to the Chinese regime that we cannot accept the way you are behaving in this world. We can't accept the way you are destroying the global society, and we can't accept the way that you're treating your own people. I think this conference is very important because it's doing what the Chinese regime is fearing the most, is telling the truth. And the truth is a very, very, very powerful thing, because the truth is often what is taking regimes and pulling them down from their all might. Therefore, today, the last things that I want to say is, all my friends, please keep up standing up against the CCP. Keep on telling the truth about how China is forcing Uyghurs to give their organs or stealing their organs, and how they are killing people to steal their organs and sell them on the market, and how this regime is destroying humanity by taking the dignity away from people. Because this is what the regime is fearing the most, that we will stand up every day and tell the truth about the horrible things that they're doing to this world.
I'd like to focus my remarks on the importance of bringing forced organ harvesting more into the public view. As you all know, the primary focus of such efforts must be the People's Republic of China, which continues to be the principal perpetrator of forced organ harvesting. As the lead Republican on the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee with jurisdiction over China, I closely monitor Beijing's efforts to remake the world in the image of the Chinese Communist Party. On every front, Beijing is challenging the free world and our premise that open societies, free markets, and the rule of law result in a more prosperous and equitable existence for everyone. This challenge is open and obvious whether we look at the PRC's territorial ambitions against its neighbors, its rampant theft of intellectual property, its manipulation of the international trading system, its penchant for secrecy and cover-ups which led to the COVID-19 pandemic, or any number of other issues. But perhaps the Chinese Communist Party's most fundamental challenge to the free world is in the area of human rights. Indeed, Xi Jinping reveals in his writings he doesn't believe in human rights. Rather, he believes human rights are a bourgeois belief system that will be superseded by the Marxist ideals of the CCP. Xi's vision goes hand in hand with the CCP's bloody history, a history stained by the continuous effort to strengthen the party and smother all dissent by undermining the values that are cherished by freedom-loving people around the world. The CCP has trampled political rights in Tiananmen Square in Hong Kong, squelched the freedom of speech through the Great Firewall, and obviously crushed any notion of freedom of religion. Not only has the CCP sought to eliminate the practice of Falun Gong, it has attempted to stifle Christianity and uproot the unique culture of Tibet, going as far as trying to dictate who the next Dalai Lama will be. And they've taken this campaign to a whole new level in Xinjiang with widespread slavery, rape, torture, and mass incarceration of the Uyghurs and other minorities in modern-day concentration camps. It should come as no surprise, then, that the PRC under communist leadership is engaged in one of the most barbaric practices in human history, forced organ harvesting, to bring health and wealth to the CCP and its cronies. Sadly, the sheer scope and scale of the organ harvesting in China is truly breathtaking. According to well-known estimates, 60 to 100,000 organ transplants occur each year in the PRC, most of which are the result of forced organ harvesting. The principal source of the organs used in these transplants are Falun Gong practitioners. This despicable practice allows China to maintain a virtual on-demand organ transplant regime, which is unheard of even in the most developed countries. In the face of this barbaric persecution, the number of Falun Gong practitioners has dwindled, and I'm afraid the CCP's next source of organs may be the Uyghurs. To some, this might sound too evil to be true. In fact, I'm afraid that that's what some of my colleagues in Congress think, which makes this event so important. Over the past several years, however, the evidence that has become increasingly clear that the PRC is engaged in state-sponsored organ harvesting. In 2019, the China Tribunal released its final judgment documenting widespread and systematic human rights abuses against the Falun Gong practitioners in China. The important practices documented by the China Tribunal echo the findings of other recent efforts to document these horrific abuses. Taken together, these reports make clear that the CCP's view of human rights stands in direct opposition to nearly every other nation in the civilized world. Incredibly, the CCP believes that individuals exist to serve the state and the party. Therefore, the CCP has no concerns about harvesting organs from individuals who they deem undesirable despite each person's intrinsic right to life. Because the CCP's worldview is fundamentally at odds with that of the free world, they are trying to protect their values by undermining ours at every turn. This makes your participation at this conference all the more important, as your efforts will not only expose one of the world's most barbaric human rights abuses, but also help to reveal the true nature of the Chinese Communist Party. Let me leave you with this. A world that conforms to the values of the CCP is one in which those who don't toe the party line can be put in a concentration camp or have their organs harvested. That's a vision for a world that nobody wants to live in. And that's the vision of the world that we are all fighting against.
These experts tell part of the story. But what about ordinary Canadians? How do they feel when they find out the truth about forced organ harvesting?
Wow, that's scary. That's scary. It's really funny. I work for a non-for-profit charity, and to think about rights and human rights. If this is something that's happening, that's devastating.
Just based on what I know, I think it's a pretty horrible process. I feel like what's being done is a crime, especially in other parts of the world. So for, obviously not like myself, I'm not in need of an organ, but if I was, or somebody that I know or love was in need of an organ, I would hope that it could be done more professionally and more of a controlled environment, and more of a way, a little more legal. Yeah, so I think it's pretty horrible. Long story short.
Horrified. Absolutely horrified. Why would anyone do that to another human being? Beyond my comprehension.
I have to say, it's very shocking to hear. As someone who hasn't heard about it before, you mentioning it is so shocking. I have to sort of say I'm taken aback by the claims. I mean, it's very upsetting.
I was just as shocked myself. I'd heard rumors, but now is the time to act.
In the United Kingdom, Lord Hunt of King's Heath has led the way with a private member's bill on forced organ harvesting. Here he tells us about the progress.
It's with great pleasure that I speak at this World Summit. There's sadness that such a summit should be necessary. My interest in tackling the issue of forced organ harvesting in China came about after I was a sponsor for the opt-out organ donation bill in the United Kingdom, which is now in UK legislation. My viewpoint being that if we're to ask the UK public to have full confidence in an opt-out system, it's even more vital that there are the best ethics surrounding the change in the law. So when I first heard about forced organ harvesting in China, I was horrified. Organ donation is a precious act of saving a life. But forced organ harvesting is commercialised murder and without doubt amongst the worst of crimes. I've spoken out against forced organ harvesting many times in the House of Lords, and I'm pleased to say that a great number of my fellow peers have shown support on this issue. In January this year, after huge pressure from across the House, my amendment to the Medicines and Medical Devices Bill was the first piece of UK legislation to fight against forced organ harvesting by ensuring that no medicines in the UK could include human tissues from victims of forced organ harvesting. It was a small, but I think significant step in legislative change, but it's only the beginning of the work that we must do here in the UK to prevent complicity in this horrific crime, and my hope that it acts as a precedent for further action, both in this country and around the world. In the United Kingdom, I will continue to make this happen. In May this year, my private member's bill, Organ Tourism and Cadavers on Display Bill, was given its first reading. This bill serves to further protect UK citizens from complicity in forced organ harvesting by amending the Human Tissue Act in two ways. First, by ensuring UK citizens cannot travel to countries such as China for organ transplantation. Though the wording of the bill is not specific about the country, but it is specific about the restrictions that are based on ensuring appropriate consent, no coercion and no financial gain. Second, to put a stop to the dreadful travelling circus of body exhibitions which sources deceased bodies from China, I came from Birmingham in the United Kingdom. In 2018, an exhibition called Real Bodies by Imagine Exhibitions visited the National Exhibition Centre. It consisted of real corpses and body parts that had gone through a process of plastination, whereby silicone plastic is injected into the body tissue to create life mannequins or plastinated bodies. The exhibit advertised it as uses real human specimens that have been respectfully preserved to explore the complex inner workings of the human form in a refreshing and thought-provoking style. But dig a little deeper, and those deceased human bodies and body parts are unclaimed bodies with no identity documents or consent, sourced from Dalian Hoffen Biotech in Dalian, China. And the commercial exploitation of body parts in all its forms is unethical and unsavoury, and when it's combined with mass killing by an authoritarian state, we cannot stand by and do nothing. In 2019, the China Tribunal, led by Sir Geoffrey Nice QC, who is knighted for services to international criminal justice, stated that the tribunal's members are certain unanimously and sure beyond reasonable doubt that in China forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience have been practiced for a substantial period of time, involving a very substantial number of victims, and that Falun Gong practitioners have been one and probably the main source of organ supply. And that in regard to the Uyghurs, the tribunal had evidence of medical testing on a scale that could allow them, amongst other uses, to become an organ bank. And we're now hearing further testimonies during the course of the Uyghur Tribunal of potential forced organ harvesting of the Uyghurs, and including those who testified of the discovery of medical files detailing all the Uyghur detainees' blood types and results of liver tests whilst they were working to a Uyghur camp. Ethan Gutman gave testimony detailing his investigations and recent December 2020 report. So what can we do internationally to stop this crime? Well, Spain, Italy, Taiwan, Israel, Belgium, Norway, South Korea have already taken legislative action to prevent organ tourism in China. A number of states and countries around the world have made statements and passed resolutions against forced organ harvesting. Mixed sanctions against perpetrators are yet to be used and could play an important role. Universities and medical companies and institutions should also prevent their own complicity and take a stand against forced organ harvesting. There is much more to do. International government action must continue. It is all our duty to act when we see innocent people falling victim to such dreadful crimes. It's taken a long time for many countries to take legislative action to combat forced organ harvesting. For many years, there were doubts as to whether the crime was actually happening, easily thought too horrendous to possibly be true. The Chinese government have always denied the crimes, brushing them off as rumours, and the World Health Organization has continually backed this up. However, it was revealed by the UK government in 2019 that the World Health Organization's assessment is based on China's own self-assessment, and that the WHO has not carried out its own assessment of Chinese organ transplant system. The WHO does not have an independent expert compliance assessment mechanism in place to carry out such an assessment. It merely has a reporting requirement. Over the years of forced organ harvesting has continued to build, and whistleblowers have stepped forward. The body of evidence becoming vast, including detailed statistical analysis of transplantations and donations, numerous recorded undercover telephone conversations, legal and policy statements, and the practice of the government and the party, advertisements, admissions of university and military personnel, and a large number of personal testimonies. It's such a volume of evidence, not always easy to collate and assess. But the China Tribunal judgment has enabled many in government to start taking the issue of forced organ harvesting more seriously. The tribunal members assessed all available evidence over the course of 12 months, a task that the government simply wouldn't have had time to do themselves. Now, my bill has been introduced in the House of Lords. It still has a long way to go before potentially being passed. This is because private members' bills really have time during the session to pass through both houses, the Lords and the Commons. In fact, it's the third time my bill has been introduced to the House, as each new session the bill has to start again. So the best option is for our government to see that we give a huge amount of support to the bill and decide to write their own bill. Once a bill had government backing, it will go through its necessary proceedings far more smoothly. So it requires dedicated politicians with dedicated support from campaigners for legislative change to take place. I hope this event inspires many around the world to take positive action against this crime. Thank you.
Song Kim, a South Korean judge, outlines the role that sanctions have played in addressing human rights abuses in China.
Thank you for having me at this meaningful World Summit. In this session, I'd like to suggest the Global Magnetic Sanction, let's say GMS, as measures to combat and prevent forced organ harvesting in China. Today, we have to face the fact that People's Republic of China and Chinese Communist Party have been forcibly harvesting organs from their innocent citizens for over 20 years. No one will deny that it is a crime against humanity. It took a long time for us to face the fact as it is. As a jurist, I think the China Tribunal put an end to the dispute on whether it really happens. Now we really need to put together our knowledge to end up this tragedy. Then how? It's not a crime committed by some individuals, but a systematic massacre by one sovereign state. Moreover, this state is a member of the UN Security Council as well as Human Rights Council. It might take another 20 years for UN to take effective actions against the crime. It's not really easy to make a concerted decision among 193 member states who have all different interests and principles under today's international politics. In this situation, autonomous sanctions by individual countries could be one option. And I think the global magnetic sanctions which US, Canada, EU, UK adopted in recent years are good examples. In US, the Global Magnetic Human Rights Accountability Act was enacted in 2016. It applies globally, authorizes the US government to sanction foreign persons implicated in human rights abuses anywhere in the world, freezing any US assets they hold and banning them from entry into the United States. It's encouraging that on July 2020, the US government sanctioned Chinese government entities in Xinjiang and government officials for human rights abuses against Uyghurs. It opened up the possibilities of similar sanctions targeting Chinese government entities and officials. Furthermore, a very noteworthy phenomenon is that these countries are forming magnetic alliance. On March this year, the United States, the European Union, Canada, and United Kingdom all together launched coordinated sanctions against officials in China over human rights abuses in the Xinjiang region. This kind of cooperation creates a synergy effect. US Department of State made a statement that they will continue to stand with their allies around the world in calling for an immediate end to the Chinese crimes and for justice for many victims. And finally, US Congress is in progress to impose GMS on those involved in forced organ harvesting. Back in 2016, the US House of Representatives unanimously passed Resolution 343 to call on China to end the crime. And on March this year, 5 Congress members introduced the bipartisan bill Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act of 2021, which includes the asset freeze and entry ban sanctions. Then, what are the advantages of GMS in legal aspects compared with other sanctions? First, advantage of the GMS is that it is enacted and implemented only if its sovereign country makes the decision at domestic level, thus making it possible to impose sanctions on the foreign criminals promptly and timely. Second, since it does not directly target the criminal state itself, but only the criminal persons, it is relatively free from the infringement of sovereignty. When the West countries raise human rights issues in China and Hong Kong, China always hits back at the criticism, arguing that the interference in its domestic affairs. But sanctions on individuals avoid this kind of Sisyphus nonsense. Third, entry ban and asset freeze can be justified by less strict proof than the sentence of guilt by the criminal court, since the former is lighter than the latter. Moreover, each nation has a wide discretionary power in the immigration control. Finally, it is a form of smart sanctions which can avoid an intended adverse impact on the vulnerable populations who are not involved in the crime. To summary, global magnetic sanctions are available and convenient measures at present against China's forced organ harvesting.
Perhaps the most significant presentation of the World Summit was the announcement of a Universal Declaration of Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting by Arthur L. Caplan, a leader in medical ethics.
Hello, I'm Arthur Caplan. I'm the head of the Division of Medical Ethics at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine, and I've been working for many, many years on issues surrounding transplantation, both procurement and allocation, both in the United States and overseas. And today I'm very proud to announce, endorse, and urge support for the Universal Declaration on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting. This is a document that builds on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which recognizes the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family as the foundation, the fundamental foundation for freedom and justice and peace in the world. The Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Dignity of the Human Being with regard to the application of biology and medicine further cements this Universal Declaration I'm announcing to you today, and it has a protocol on human rights and biomedicine concerning transplantation of organs and tissues. So, building on those documents, the Universal Declaration on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting says and does many things, but most importantly, in my view, it calls on all governments to combat and prevent forced organ harvesting by providing for the criminalization of certain acts and to facilitate both at the national and international levels the criminal prosecution of forced organ harvesting. What do we mean by certain acts? The Declaration means organ donation should always be donation. It should not be coerced. It should not be something that does not respect the choice of the individual. And it has to show fundamental respect in getting organs and tissues for transplant for the individual's welfare and well-being. If it's not doing that, it ought to be illegal. I think all governments, as the Declaration says, should take the necessary legislative measures to establish as criminal under their domestic laws the removal of human organs from living or deceased donors, especially when that removal is performed without the free, informed, and specific consent of the living donor or prior to their death by the deceased donor. It's time to reinforce basic decency and respect for persons in the field of transplantation everywhere in the world. It's time to ensure that forced organ harvesting that does not rely on phony consents or coerced consents comes to a halt. Nations engaged in such practices must be identified, called to account, held responsible, and even boycotted until transplantation is operating under a moral framework of free choice and respect. I think this declaration does it. I hope you'll support it, and I thank you for listening.
A key part of the Declaration is Article 5, which reads in part, "At the national level, the Universal Declaration on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting expounds that all governments shall take the necessary legislative and other measures to criminalize forced organ harvesting under their domestic law to punish those responsible for this crime, and that the judiciary shall initiate and ensure effective criminal investigation and prosecution of any and all offenses. The administrative systems of all governments shall bar entry to any person known to be directly or indirectly participating in forced organ harvesting, and shall dissuade their own medical professionals from training Chinese doctors or medical personnel in transplant surgery, and shall urge medical journals to reject publications about the Chinese experience, that in transplant medicine and the like. Meanwhile, each country should enhance the public's awareness of the unlawfulness of forced organ harvesting.
So what is Canada doing to answer this call to action? We already signed on for Magnitsky sanctions. But what about legislation? There have been two key leaders who have introduced legislation to make forced organ harvesting a crime under Canadian law.
Garnet Jenis and Selma Atulazan.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, again, sort of the paradox in terms of Canadian action and leadership on the one hand, but falling behind in other respects. It was Canadians, David Kilgour and David Matas, who really blew the whistle on this issue of organ harvesting and trafficking in China. And other countries have passed legislation that is substantially informed by their work and their research. But Canada itself, at the legislative level, has not passed any legislation on this, and it's been 15 years that parliamentarians have been trying to get bills through. We've really gotten the furthest in the 6 or so years since I've been there working with others, and we've primarily had this success by starting legislation in the Senate, seeing it pass the Senate, and then trying to move it forward in the House of Commons. But we haven't been able to get it over the finish line. There was a lack of ability to move it forward fast enough in the 41st Parliament. Then in the last Parliament, again, tried to get support to expedite it. We weren't able to get there. And so now we're starting again in the 43rd Parliament. So in terms of Canadian leadership on this, I mean, the first step is for us to take that simple action of passing legislation to combat organ harvesting, legislation that would make it illegal for someone to go abroad and receive an organ taken without consent. We have the model, the template that other countries can use as well. So I think once we pass it, we can promote that and work with other countries to get the word out. I know there are some efforts around passing organ harvesting and trafficking legislation in the United States. There are other attempts being made around the world. So Canada should act first and then promote its model by sharing its experience with other countries.
Everything will play a positive role. You know, we need everyone to be on side with the legislation to, if something is happening which is not illegal, which is harming people, everyone who speaks out, every little bit helps us. And like I said, Canada is behind its allies. Canada, we really, there's a great need to pass this legislation. And I'm hoping this time it will. We're giving the House enough time to look at it, study it. It's the exact bill they sent us. We're sending it back to them. I mean, it makes sense. Let's do the right thing. Let's pass this legislation. It's not it's not partisan. It's about the good of vulnerable people all over the world. It's about making Canadians understand that sometimes when they go overseas to get an organ, they have to find out what's happening. And I'm sure most people, if they knew how the organs are being harvested, would not go for it if it wasn't illegally. I mean, we've heard cases of people being kidnapped. They wake up and they're missing an organ. I wouldn't want that hanging over my head.
Would Canadians support such legislation? I think you know the answer. The Canadians we spoke to seem universally in favor of not only Canadian legislation, but Canada taking a leading role on the world stage as well.
Would you support Canada in taking a leading role in making this a crime?
Yes, I would. Like I said, I've heard a lot of horrible things about it, and I feel the wrong people are benefiting from it. So if there's going to be some kind of law put in place to stop this, I'd definitely be for it.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. Like in a millisecond.
That up 100%. Yeah, I think we should do that.
For sure. It's basically murder. Yeah, that's horrible.
Yes. Yes, I would.
Absolutely.
If Canada was to take a leading role in making this a crime, would you support that?
Of course. Absolutely. Yeah, because they're using prisoners who, they're still human beings, and even if they've done bad things, they still have rights. And at least that's how we look at it here in Canada, and I think that that's absolutely acceptable.
Perhaps two of the most impactful people for me in this process were a woman whose family was almost destroyed by the Nazis and the Holocaust, and a man who lost his father to kidney failure. Worlds apart, these two help to remind us that the bell tolls for us all if we turn aside. I'm sitting with Ryan right now. Ryan is a Canadian citizen, and he is going to share with us the story of his father's kidney transplant. Ryan, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Tell me about your dad.
Well, my father my father was an amazing person. I was in high school, and I'd just come home from school, and the house phone rang, and it was my mother telling me that my dad wasn't well, and that he was in the hospital. So my siblings and we all rushed over to the hospital, and me personally, I couldn't recognize the person I was staring at. He was an entirely different person than someone that I'd seen in the morning.
All in one day this happens?
All in
that
one day.
quick?
It was just crazy. We were just taken back by everything. He was fine, and then he just looked like an entirely different person. His kidneys, both of them, were failing, and we were just at a loss. We just didn't understand how this just happened like that, and it's all because my father is one of these strong, silent type of guys, and he basically, he was suffering in silence, and he just kept doing what he had to do, and then his body just couldn't take it anymore, and he ended up in the hospital. So we all wanted to, once the doctors told us that the kidneys were failing, we were like, okay, no problem. We got this under control.
This is a major hospital in a Canadian city.
This is St. Joseph's Hospital, right, down on Lakeshore, and
in Toronto.
In Toronto, and we were like, okay, you know what? We all have 2 kidneys. Let's get tested, and we can just go through and see, what's a match. My father then said that no, that's not going to happen, because he. Again, very old school, different type of just the understanding of everything. Is like, why am I going to take away a part of your life, right, to just extend mine for a little bit, right? That's the way he looked at it. So we didn't go through with any of the testing because he didn't want it. He said, you guys want to do it? I won't take it. And
so very quickly, your father is told he's in kidney failure.
Yep.
He will require a new kidney. He is a strong, proud man. He does not want the family to donate a kidney, so he goes on the transplant list.
Exactly.
So you're now
but
waiting.
The transplant list didn't happen right away. The reason why is because they want to make sure his body is functioning properly.
So then dialysis takes over.
Dialysis takes over. So he started doing the hemodialysis, which is where they insert a fistula into the arm, and he would go in 4 times a week to complete dialysis.
How long is dialysis each time you attend the hospital?
It's anywhere between 4 to 6 hours, sometimes 7 hours, all depending.
3-4 times a week?
4 times a week. So it's a full-time job, basically. That's what he was going to.
How long did that go on, the dialysis?
That went on for 7 years.
And they've said he is eligible to be a kidney recipient on the transplant list.
Yep.
But now you wait. So he'd come to terms with living on dialysis. The transplant can still happen, but he's scared. You may live, you may die.
Yep.
There's no guarantee.
And he's been doing dialysis for 7 years. So he's gotten comfortable, right? He's gotten into that whole niche. Okay, 4 times a week, I go there, I've made friends. I'm in
kidney transplant, that's going to be great.
And everything's fine. There's no issues, right? Just like in the movies. It wasn't like that at all.
What happens now?
Lots of medication. Lots and lots of medication.
So you've had the kidney transplant. Medication owns this man's life and the family's, for that matter.
Yep.
What happens as this goes on?
Well, as everything continues on, it worked for 13 years. The kidney was functioning for 13 years.
What happened then?
Then it started to fail.
So the transplanted kidney is now failing.
13 years later, correct.
And
they're telling him that he would have to go back on to dialysis.
And what does your father want to do at this point?
He wanted to die. He didn't want to do dialysis again. He said he would rather go through another transplant than dialysis.
And did your father pass?
My father passed October 6th, 2020.
I'm so sorry to hear that. And as you told me the story, I know you and I, with what we know now, are thinking about that there were options for all those years that passed, that your family, a family of Meads, a Canadian family, could have traveled to China and, let's use the term, bought a kidney for Dad.
Yep.
Was that an option for Dad?
It was an option for us, it wasn't an option for him.
Not an option. What did Dad say about that?
He said no.
So it was discussed?
It was discussed. It was discussed. We had talked about taking out a loan because it's quite costly, right? And, going and the way it was described to us, it would be sort of like, you're going on a trip to China, right? You're just going for a visit, a little vacation.
Where did you think the organ would come from if someone was to do this? Did they tell you that?
They told us that they would have a donor. That's all they kept saying.
They would just have a donor?
They would have a donor. Right.
And your dad just said, there's no way.
There's no way, because his
Morally?
Morally, he didn't believe it. Because what he said to me was that it took 7 years for them to find someone for me. How can they find someone in a matter of days?
If, knowing what you know now and knowing what your dad was like, if we had to think about this whole process again and the loss of your dad, what would he say? Would he do it?
No, we still wouldn't do it. One thing about him was that he valued life, right? Not only his own, but everyone around him. So that was a huge part of him. So when something like this comes up where it's going to harm someone else for his benefit, it's not an option.
Because in our North American, or say Canadian system, there is the organ donor card, or someone will pass, or we'll say an accident victim, and it's a death that was inevitable.
Exactly.
That person passes and someone else can benefit, a family can benefit by the organs from that person. But in China, there's an option of illegal organ harvesting so that wealthy people may live.
Exactly. And that would have been an option again before he passed, because he wouldn't have been put back on a list to receive a transplant again, because he's already had that kidney for X amount of, for the 13 years. So if my father was a different person, we would have gone to China. And
if your father, what do you mean by that? If your father was a different person?
If he didn't value other people's lives.
I want to spin this differently, because we talked about your dad's view. What's your view on forced organ harvesting and the option of, well, I'll say, if you could have gotten your dad a kidney, what do you think?
Well, as a son, the first thing that comes to your mind is, anything to help my father. And when I first heard about that, I was like, okay, this is great. But then afterward, we had a discussion. That was one of the main factors in our relationship. We always talked. And I didn't see it as, someone else getting hurt for this. I was just seeing it as my father getting a kidney.
No one had ever said to you, Ryan, where do you think the kidney comes from?
No, they just said, okay, here's a solution. And I'm like, this is great. This is the solution to our question. And that's what we did. That's the way I looked at it. And then my father gave me a entirely different perception of it, which I would have agreed with him 100%. Even if it was to save his life and have him here for another 10 years or another 13 years as it would be, I wouldn't, because it would go against everything my father stood for, and it would go against everything I stand for.
I'd like to introduce you to Larissa Vilsker from Israel.
Лариса Вильскер, Израиль. Тема Холокоста коснулась лично моей семьи. Мой отец родился в Варшаве в 1918 году в дружной большой семье. Когда нацисты оккупировали Варшаву, все его близкие и дальние родственники были заключены в Варшавское гетто, где большинство из них погибло, включая маленьких детей. Моему отцу чудом удалось сбежать в Советский Союз, где впоследствии родилась я. С детства слышала рассказы от первого лица об ужасах, происходящих в концлагерях, о пытках, об опытах, производимых над заключенными. И мне, родившейся в послевоенные годы, все это казалось далеко в прошлом, и что такого больше никогда не повторится. Но спустя десятилетия, после моего переезда в Израиль, я узнаю, что подобные концлагеря существуют в Китае. Людей незаконно арестовывают, сажают в тюрьмы, пытают, извлекают жизненно важные органы принудительно, а затем тела их кремируют. И все это санкционировано коммунистическим режимом Китая и поставлено на промышленную платформу. И кто же и с кем же так поступают? Это высоконравственные люди, живущие по принципам духовного течения Фалун-Гун, по принципам истины, доброты, терпения, что противоположно идеологии Коммунистической партии Китая, основанной на лжи и насилии. И я, чья семья познала ужасы Холокоста, не могу оставаться равнодушной и не могу не выступить против извлечения органов у практикующих Фалун-Гун в Китае. В 2006 году я приняла участие в форуме под девизом «Никогда больше. Обращение к миру». В форуме поднималась тема извлечения органов у практикующих Фалун-Гун в Китае. Форум проходил в Освенциме, в Польше. Я считаю своим непосредственным долгом призвать все мировое сообщество пресечь угрозу для всего человечества. Китай для многих стран является выгодным экономическим партнером. Многие страны попали под его экономическую зависимость. И ради бизнеса, ради политических выгод они закрывают глаза на чудовища, происходящие в Китае. Да, мы живем в другой стране, и, казалось бы, какое нам дело до происходящего в Китае. Но если посмотреть глубже, то можно увидеть, что все страны разделены условными границами, и у всех нас есть общий дом – это планета Земля. И сегодня нам предоставляется возможность внести посильный вклад в восстановление справедливости на нашей планете Земля. Спасибо.
As we all go about our lives and go to our jobs, take care of our kids, head off to school, is that the end of it all? Well, not really. It doesn't have to be. This is a time for you to talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors, talk to the people in your family. And I think the biggest response you're going to get is shock. They're not aware that this is going on. They have absolutely no idea. So if you plant the seed with them, the seed of awareness, to let people know what is going on, that forced organ harvesting is a thing, it's real, and it is happening, and Canada is very much a part of it, and we'd maybe like to be a part of the abolishment of it. And that is somewhere you can look, something that you can get involved in. Perhaps it's time for you to help out. If you're like me, the images, the references. I've seen documented footage, people being killed, people being tortured for organs. It's considered transplant tourism in China. In fact, China, or anywhere else for that matter, if we consider a term like transplant tourism, there's a serious issue. The morals, the risks, the impact on society. I think it's time for us all to take a stand. I think one of the things we have to consider is this is all being played out on the world stage. It's forced organ harvesting. And if you, like me, knew very little about it, this documentary has truly opened my eyes. And if you're Canadian, which I am, we've always come to the aid of other countries. We've come to the aid of the downtrodden. We've come to the aid of the wounded, the hurt, the people who are in need. Maybe it's time for you and me to take a step back and look at this and try to understand what is going on and get your head around what this really means. This is called forced organ harvesting, and simply by its title, it's something that you and me, we need to look into, we need to look deeper, we need to see if there's something we can do to put an end to it.
I didn't know a lot about forced organ harvesting when we began, but that has changed. Frankly, so have I. I can't unlearn what we've seen, and I can't turn away from being, well, at least a small part of the solution. So where can we go from here? Well, here's a start. I've helped to create a website where you can see all or part of this program again. You can share it with your friends, your colleagues, you can leave comments, you can sign a petition. You can tap into other documentaries and resources on this subject and so many others. But please come visit us at ittollsforthee.com. No matter where you are, you can support the Canadian response. I hope to see you there.